The train whistle pierced the late afternoon air as it pulled into Yuma, Arizona, carrying with it dust, dreams, and one very lost Frenchwoman. Solène Valois clutched her single valise with white knuckles, her dark eyes wide as she stepped onto the wooden platform. The year was 1885, and she had traveled across an ocean and a continent to marry a man she had never met. The letters exchanged through the mail-order bride agency had promised a good life, but now that she was here, the weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her shoulders. Across the platform, Kieran Winters removed his worn Stetson and wiped the sweat from his brow. His ranch was failing, and at 32, loneliness had become as familiar to him as the calluses on his hands. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like his last chance at both companionship and help with the struggling cattle operation. He had specifically requested someone sturdy, practical, and ideally, someone who could cook. The agency had assured him that the Frenchwoman would be perfect hardworking and from farming stock. What they had neglected to mention was that she spoke not a single word of English. Solène spotted the tall man holding a crude sign with her name scrawled across it. Relief washed over her features as she approached him with a tentative smile. "Bonjour, monsieur. Je suis Solène Valois," she said, her voice melodic despite her obvious nervousness. Kieran's expression fell as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Miss Valois?" he asked, hoping against hope that she understood. She nodded enthusiastically. "Oui, c'est moi," he gestured toward himself. "Kieran Winters, Kieran," she repeated, the name rolling off her tongue with a distinctly French accent. "Enchanté." They stood awkwardly on the platform as passengers bustled around them. Kieran had never felt more out of his depth. He had fought off cattle rustlers, survived drought and blizzard, even stood his ground against a mountain lion once, but this slip of a woman with her incomprehensible words terrified him more than any of those challenges. "Well," he said finally, taking her valise, "I suppose we should head home." "Ranch," he added, pointing vaguely in the direction of his property. "You and me." He pointed between them, feeling foolish. Solène nodded, though uncertainty clouded her eyes. She had expected difficulty, but not complete inability to communicate. In her pocket was a small French-English dictionary she had purchased before leaving Paris, but the words inside seemed woefully inadequate for the life stretching before her. Kieran led her to his wagon, helping her climb onto the wooden seat before securing her valise in the back. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they set off down the dusty main street of Yuma. The town was unlike anything Solène had ever seen, a far cry from the elegant streets of Paris, where she had grown up, or even the modest village in Normandy, where she had lived with her aunt after her parents died. Wooden buildings with false fronts lined the road, and men in dust-covered clothing gave her curious glances as they passed. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, determined not to show fear. Kieran stole glances at his bride-to-be as they traveled. She was pretty, certainly, with her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat and her complexion still fair despite the journey. But he hadn't expected someone so refined. Her hands, resting in her lap, were small and unblemished by labor. What did she know of ranch life? How would she manage the harsh realities of the Arizona territory? The journey to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, the wagon jolting over the uneven terrain as they left town behind. Solène watched in fascination as the landscape changed around them, first the scrubby desert, then gradually more vegetation as they followed a meandering creek into slightly higher elevation. When they crested a small rise, Kieran pulled the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said, pointing ahead. "Winters Ranch." Solène followed his gesture to the valley below. A modest wooden house stood surrounded by several outbuildings. A corral held a few horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on sparse vegetation. It wasn't much, but something about the small homestead tugged at her heart. "Say bow," she said softly. Kieran didn't understand her words, but the tone told him enough. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's home." As they approached the ranch house, a large dog came bounding out to greet them, barking enthusiastically. Solène tensed beside him. "That's just Rex," Kieran said, reaching down to pat the dog's head when they stopped. "He won't hurt you." Solène remained frozen on the seat until Kieran came around to help her down. The dog circled them, sniffing curiously at her skirts. After a moment's hesitation, she reached out a tentative hand. Rex licked it promptly, causing her to giggle a sound that made Kieran's heart skip unexpectedly. "Rex," she said experimentally, and the dog's ears perked up. "That's right," Kieran nodded, pleased at this small communication breakthrough. He led her into the house, suddenly seeing it through a stranger's eyes. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A wooden table with 4 chairs stood in the center, and a few pieces of simple furniture were arranged near the hearth. Everything was neat but Spartan, a man's house, with no feminine touches. "Kitchen," he said, gesturing to the cast-iron stove and the pump sink. "Bedroom," he continued, pointing to a closed door on one side. "And that'll be your room," he added quickly, indicating another door. "Used to be my brother's before he moved east." Solène understood the general meaning from his gestures and nodded gratefully. "Merci," she said, the relief evident in her voice when she realized she would have her own room. Kieran carried her valise to the small bedroom, then stood awkwardly in the main room as she inspected her new home. She ran a finger along the table, then peered into the cast-iron pots hanging near the stove. "I'll let you get settled," he said, backing toward the door. "Got chores to finish before dark." She looked at him uncomprehendingly, and he mimed feeding animals. "Chores," he repeated, feeling ridiculous. "Ah," she nodded. "Oui." When Kieran returned an hour later, he found Solène had changed into a simpler dress and was examining the contents of his pantry with a furrowed brow. She turned when he entered, gesturing to the meager supplies. "Say tout?" she asked. He shrugged helplessly. "Don't understand, miss." She pointed to the food, then spread her hands in a questioning gesture. "Oh, that's all I've got at the moment," he confirmed. "Was planning to get more supplies next week." She sighed and set about preparing a meal with what was available: some dried beans, salt pork, and cornmeal. Kieran watched in amazement as her capable hands transformed the simple ingredients into something that smelled far better than his usual fare. They ate in awkward silence, occasionally attempting to communicate through gestures. After dinner, Solène pulled out her small dictionary and began paging through it. "English," she said, pointing to the book, then to herself. "Je dois apprendre l'anglais." Kieran leaned forward, understanding dawning. "You want to learn English?" "Oui, English," she confirmed. He grinned for the first time since meeting her. "And I reckon I should learn some French." That night, as Solène lay in the narrow bed in her new room, tears slid silently down her cheeks. The journey from France had been long and terrifying. Her parents had died in a fire when she was 16, leaving her to live with an aunt who had recently passed as well. With no prospects and no family left in France, the advertisement seeking a bride in America had seemed like providence. Now, faced with the reality of her situation, alone in a foreign land with a man she couldn't understand, doubt overwhelmed her. In the main room, Kieran lay on his bedroll near the fireplace, having given up his bedroom to his future bride. He stared at the ceiling, wondering what madness had possessed him to send for a wife from halfway around the world. His ranch was struggling, the ongoing drought making it nearly impossible to maintain his small herd. The last thing he needed was another mouth to feed, especially one that couldn't even help properly due to the language barrier. Yet there had been something in Solene's eyes that afternoon, a determination, a spark of spirit that reminded him why he'd come west in the first place. The promise of building something from nothing, of forging a life through sheer willpower and hard work. Perhaps, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, they might find a way forward together after all. Morning came early on the ranch. Kieran rose with the first light, moving quietly to avoid waking Solène. He was surprised to find her already in the kitchen, rekindling the fire in the stove. She had dressed in what appeared to be her plainest clothes, still too fine for ranch work, but clearly an attempt to adapt. "Bonjour," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied. She pointed to herself, then mimed cooking. "G. Pew Ader, you want to help," he guessed. When she nodded, he smiled. "Well, that's mighty kind of you. Coffee would be welcome." He showed her where he kept the coffee beans and how to use the grinder. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through him. Solène seemed to feel it too, her cheeks coloring slightly as she turned her attention to the task. While she prepared breakfast, Kieran went out to begin his morning chores. The familiar routine of feeding the animals and checking the water levels in the troughs calmed his nerves. When he returned to the house, the aroma that greeted him was nothing short of miraculous. Somehow, Solène had transformed the last of his flour and some dried apples into pastries that made his mouth water. "This looks incredible," he said, sitting at the table. She smiled, pleased by his reaction even if she didn't understand the words. "Bon appétit," she replied, taking the seat opposite him. After breakfast, Kieran faced a dilemma. He needed to ride out to check on his cattle, but he couldn't leave Solène alone without any way to communicate if there was trouble. In the end, he decided to take her with him, reasoning that it would give her a chance to see the ranch and perhaps begin to understand the life they would share. He found an old saddle in the barn that had belonged to his late mother and adjusted it for Solène. When he led out a gentle mare named Daisy, however, his bride-to-be looked at the animal with undisguised terror. "Gni jamais monté a cheval," she said, backing away slightly. Kieran didn't need to understand the words to read her fear. "Never ridden," he guessed. She shook her head. "It's all right," he said gently. "Daisy here is gentle as they come. Look." He demonstrated by stroking the mare's neck and feeding her an apple slice from breakfast. Gradually, Solène approached and tentatively reached out to touch the horse's nose. "There you go," Kieran encouraged. "She likes you." It took some time and patience, but eventually Kieran managed to help Solène mount the horse. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the saddle horn, but she didn't cry out or try to dismount. He adjusted her posture slightly, showing her how to sit properly, then mounted his own horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Buck. "We'll take it nice and slow," he promised, though he knew she didn't understand the words. They rode at a walk, Kieran leading Daisy by a lead rope while Solène gradually grew more comfortable in the saddle. He took her along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property, pointing out landmarks and naming them clearly. "Creek," he said, gesturing to the flowing water. "Creek," she repeated carefully. "Cattle," he continued, pointing to the small herd grazing in the distance. "Cattle," she echoed, her pronunciation improving with each word. By midday, they had covered much of the ranch's perimeter, and Solène had learned a dozen English words. They stopped for a simple lunch of bread and jerky beside the creek, sitting in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Your ranch," Solène said hesitantly, using one of her new words. "Beautiful." Kieran felt a swell of pride at her assessment. "Thank you," he replied. "Been working this land for 7 years now." She tilted her head questioningly, not understanding. He held up 7 fingers, then pointed to the ranch and himself. 7 years. "Ah," she nodded. "Sept ans." She pointed to herself, then toward the east. "Paris 23 ans." "You lived in Paris for 23 years, he guessed. "Oui," she confirmed. "I am." She paused, consulting her small dictionary. 25 years. "I'm 32, Kieran replied, holding up the appropriate number of fingers. As they rode back to the ranch house, Kieran found himself stealing glances at Solène. The initial panic had begun to fade from her eyes, replaced by curiosity and something like determination. She sat straighter in the saddle now, her body beginning to move with the horse's gait rather than against it. The woman had grit, he had to give her that. Upon returning to the house, Kieran showed Solène the small vegetable garden behind the kitchen. It had seen better days, the drought had taken its toll, and he hadn't had time to tend it properly, but her eyes lit up at the sight. "Jardin," she said, crouching to examine the struggling plants. "G. Pew," he nodded, understanding her request. "It's all yours." She smiled brightly, and for a moment, Kieran forgot all about the language barrier and the impracticality of their arrangement. That smile transformed her face, revealing dimples he hadn't noticed before and making her dark eyes sparkle. It hit him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily breathless. That evening, after another simple but surprisingly delicious meal, Solène brought out her dictionary again. This time, she had a determined set to her jaw as she pointed to objects around the room and repeated their English names. "Table," she said. "Chair, fire, window, door." Kieran found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. "That's right," he encouraged. She pointed to him. "Kieran." "Yes," he nodded, then pointed to her. "Solène." "Solène," she agreed. Then, to his surprise, she pointed between them and said carefully, "Married." He blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. "Well, that's the plan," he said slowly. "When you're ready. No rush." She consulted her dictionary again, then said, "When?" Kieran ran a hand through his hair, considering. The agreement with the mail-order bride agency had been clear they would be married upon her arrival. But now, faced with the reality of their situation, rushing into marriage seemed foolish. "How about we give it a month?" he suggested, holding up one finger. "1 month, get to know each other first." She nodded slowly. "Un mois." "Right," he said, relieved she understood. 1 month. As the days passed, a tentative routine developed on the Winters ranch. Mornings began with breakfast together, followed by Kieran teaching Solène practical English words related to ranch life. She proved to be a quick study, her vocabulary expanding daily. Afternoons found her working in the garden, which was already showing signs of revival under her care, or attempting to improve the interior of the house with limited resources. For his part, Kieran found himself looking forward to their meals together. He'd lived alone for so long that having another person in the house, especially one who transformed simple ingredients into remarkable food, was a pleasure he hadn't anticipated. He began making an effort to finish his chores earlier, so they could have more time for language lessons in the evenings. A week after Solène's arrival, they ventured into Yuma for supplies. The small town seemed less intimidating to her now, though the stares of the townspeople made her straighten her posture and lift her chin defiantly. Kieran noticed the way men's eyes followed her down the street, and he felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. At the general store, Walter Jenkins greeted them with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the bride I've been hearing about," he said, looking Solène up and down. "French, ain't she?" "This is Miss Solène Valois," Kieran said formally. "Solène, this is Mr. Jenkins." Bonjour, she said with a polite nod. Don't speak English, Jenkins asked, raising an eyebrow. She's learning, Kieran replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. We'll need the usual supplies, plus some extra flour and sugar, and whatever fabric you've got that might do for curtains. While Jenkins gathered their order, Solène wandered the store, examining the various goods with interest. She paused at a display of books, running her fingers along the spines with longing. You like books? Kieran asked, coming to stand beside her. Oui, she nodded. I miss reading. Understanding dawned on Kieran. Of course she had no access to books in her own language here. He had a few dog-eared novels and a Bible, but nothing in French. Pick one, he said, gesturing to the books. To help with your English. Her eyes widened. Truly, he nodded, and she carefully selected a volume with simple stories meant for schoolchildren. The gratitude in her eyes when she thanked him made Kieran's chest tighten strangely. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Abigail Porter entered the store. The minister's wife was known throughout Yuma for her charitable works and her equally formidable talent for gossip. Mr. Winters, she greeted them, and this must be your bride from abroad. Miss Valois, Kieran introduced. She's from France. How lovely, Mrs. Porter said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. And when will the wedding take place? Kieran shifted uncomfortably. We haven't set a date yet. Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose. I see. Well, I'm sure Reverend Porter would be happy to perform the ceremony whenever you're ready, though I must say, it's rather unusual for an unmarried couple to be living together. Her disapproval was clear, and Kieran felt his ears burning with embarrassment. Beside him, Solène seemed to understand the general tenor of the conversation, if not the specific words. Wedding, she asked quietly, looking up at Kieran. Mrs. Porter was just asking about our plans, Kieran explained awkwardly. Perhaps Sunday after services would be appropriate, Mrs. Porter suggested. The sooner the better to avoid any impropriety. Kieran wanted to argue that their living arrangement was perfectly innocent. He was still sleeping on a bedroll by the fire. For heaven's sake, but he knew how it looked to the town. And the last thing he wanted was for Solène's reputation to suffer. I'll discuss it with Miss Valois, he said finally. Good day, Mrs. Porter. On the wagon ride home, Kieran explained the situation as best he could to Solène. People in town, they think we should be married, soon. She nodded slowly, understanding more than he expected, because we live together. Yes, he confirmed. But only if you're ready. I won't rush you. Solène was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the landscape passing by. Finally, she turned to him, her expression serious but not fearful. Sunday, she said. We marry Sunday. Kieran studied her face, searching for any sign of reluctance. You're sure? Yes, she said firmly. I come for this, to be wife. Her direct gaze held something that made his heart beat faster, not just resignation to her fate, but a kind of quiet courage that he admired tremendously. All right then, he agreed. Sunday it is. The days leading up to the wedding were a flurry of activity. Solène worked tirelessly to make the house more presentable, hanging the new curtains and scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Kieran repaired things he'd been neglecting: a loose porch step, a squeaky door hinge, a crack in one window. Together, they created a home that was beginning to feel like it belonged to both of them. On Saturday evening, Kieran's closest friend Samuel Taylor rode over from his neighboring ranch, bringing with him a small crate of oranges as a wedding gift. Thought the lady might appreciate a taste of something sweet, Sam explained as Kieran introduced them. My sister sends them up from her grove in Southern California. Merci beaucoup, Solène said, delighted by the gift. Oranges. Sam's friendly manner and slow, clear speech made it easier for Solène to understand him. By the end of his visit, she was laughing at his stories about Kieran's early days in Arizona, though she only understood a fraction of the words. After Sam departed, Kieran and Solène sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The air between them felt charged somehow, full of unspoken thoughts about the day to come. "Are you nervous?" Kieran asked, though he wasn't sure she would understand. Solène considered for a moment. "Yes," she admitted. "And you?" He nodded. "Yeah, I am, but I'm also—" He searched for a simple word. "Happy." She smiled at that. "Moi aussi, me too." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, each lost in their own thoughts about the vows they would exchange tomorrow, promises made in a language that one of them was still struggling to comprehend. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Kieran rose early, bathed in the creek, and put on his best shirt, one he hadn't worn since his brother's wedding 3 years prior. When Solène emerged from her bedroom, he found himself momentarily speechless. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, her dark hair arranged in an elegant twist adorned with small wildflowers. "You look—" he began, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "Merci," she said softly, a blush coloring her cheeks. The church in Yuma was a modest wooden structure, but it was filled with curious townspeople when they arrived. Reverend Porter met them at the door, his manner kind despite his wife's disapproval. "I understand there may be some difficulty with the language," he said to Kieran. "I'll keep the service simple." Kieran nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Reverend." As they stood before the altar, Kieran found himself acutely aware of Solène beside him, the faint lavender scent that clung to her, the slight tremor in her hand as she placed it in his. When the Reverend asked them to recite their vows, Kieran spoke clearly and deliberately, giving her time to follow along in the small prayer book provided. When it was Solène's turn, she spoke carefully, her French accent lending a musical quality to the familiar words. "I, Solène, take you, Kieran, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward." There was something profoundly moving about hearing her struggle through the English vows, determined to be understood on this most important of days. By the time she finished, Kieran was blinking back unexpected emotion. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Porter concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Kieran hesitated, suddenly unsure. They had never discussed this part of the ceremony, and he didn't want to presume. But Solène solved the dilemma by rising slightly on her toes and pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. It was brief and chaste, but Kieran felt it like a jolt of lightning through his body. When she pulled away, her eyes held a mix of shyness and something warmer that made his breath catch. The small reception at the church hall afterward was awkward but not unpleasant. The women of Yuma had provided food, and while many were clearly curious about the French bride, most were welcoming in their own way. Mrs. Porter, in particular, seemed to have decided that since they were properly married, she could now take Solène under her wing. "You must join our Ladies' Aid Society," she told Solène, speaking slowly and clearly. "We meet every Wednesday afternoon." "Merci," Solène replied politely, though she glanced at Kieran with slight panic. He intervened smoothly. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Porter," but Solène still getting settled at the ranch. "Perhaps in a few weeks." When they finally returned home to their home, Kieran corrected mentally the awkwardness that had been held at bay during the busy day descended upon them. They stood in the main room, husband and wife in name, but still virtual strangers in reality. "Well," Kieran said finally, clearing his throat, "it's been a long day." Solène nodded, twisting her new gold band around her finger nervously. I'll just make up my bedroll by the fire, he continued, moving toward the chest where he kept his blankets. No, Solène said, stopping him with a hand on his arm. Your room. She pointed to the master bedroom. Your bed. Kieran shook his head. I can't take your room, Solène. She frowned in concentration, clearly struggling to express a complex thought with her limited vocabulary. Finally, she retrieved her dictionary and paged through it frantically. Share, she said finally, pointing to the word. We are married, we. Share. Kieran's heart pounded in his chest. Are you sure? I don't expect I am sure, she interrupted, her gaze steady despite the blush staining her cheeks. That night, they lay side by side in the darkness of the master bedroom, a careful few inches separating their bodies. Kieran was acutely aware of Solène's presence, the sound of her breathing, the faint scent of lavender, the slight dip in the mattress where she lay. Neither spoke, but Kieran sensed she was as awake as he was, contemplating the strange new reality of their marriage. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he felt Solène's hand find his beneath the blankets. Her fingers intertwined with his, warm and surprisingly strong. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and she returned the pressure. No words were needed for this simple communication, the first truly mutual understanding they had shared. Morning found them still holding hands, though they had shifted in sleep, so that Solène's head rested against Kieran's shoulder. When he woke to find her nestled against him, Kieran remained perfectly still, not wanting to disturb the moment. She looked peaceful in sleep, the worry lines that often creased her brow smoothed away. Eventually, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find him watching her. Instead of pulling away in embarrassment, she offered a sleepy smile. Bonjour, she murmured. Good morning, he replied softly. They rose and began their day, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained was gradually giving way to a tentative closeness. At breakfast, Solène's hand lingered when she passed Kieran the coffee. While teaching her the English names for the tools in the barn, he stood closer than strictly necessary. Each small touch, each shared smile, built a bridge across the chasm of language and culture that separated them. As the weeks passed, Solène's English improved dramatically. She devoured the children's book Kieran had bought her, then moved on to his small collection of novels. He found her one evening with his mother's old Bible, laboriously comparing passages in English to a tiny French New Testament she had brought with her from Paris. Smart, he commented, tapping his temple. She looked up with a smile. It helps to see the same words in both languages. Kieran was learning some French as well, though his progress was slower. Each night before bed, Solène taught him a few phrases. He struggled with the pronunciation, his tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, but her patience never wavered. One evening, about a month after the wedding, a violent thunderstorm rolled across the ranch. The wind howled around the eaves of the house, and lightning cracked so close that the windows rattled in their frames. Solène, who had been reading by the fire, jumped at a particularly loud thunderclap. It's all right, Kieran reassured her, moving from his chair to sit beside her on the small sofa. Just a storm. We don't have such storms in Paris, she said, her voice tight with anxiety. When the next bolt of lightning struck, followed immediately by a deafening crash of thunder, Solène instinctively pressed closer to Kieran. He put his arm around her shoulders, feeling her trembling. I've got you, he murmured. You're safe. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. I know, she said simply. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then, with a courage that took his breath away, Solène leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their wedding kiss, this was no brief, ceremonial gesture. Her mouth was soft and warm against his, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where his heart thundered louder than the storm outside. Kieran responded instinctively, drawing her closer, his free hand tangling in her hair as it came loose from its pins. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "Solène," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "Je crois que je commence à t'aimer," she said softly. He didn't understand the words, but the tone made his heart leap. "What does that mean?" She smiled a little shyly. "It means, I think I am starting to love you." Kieran felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. In that moment, he realized that what had begun as a practical arrangement had become something far more meaningful. This woman, with her courage and determination, her gentle strength and quick mind, had somehow worked her way into his heart when he wasn't looking. "I think I'm starting to love you too," he admitted. That night when they went to bed, there was no careful distance between them. Solène came willingly into Kieran's arms, and their kisses grew increasingly passionate. When he pulled back, questioning, she nodded her permission. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a physical expression of the connection that had been growing between them despite, or perhaps, because of the challenges they had faced together. Afterward, as Solène lay with her head on his chest, Kieran stroked her hair and made a decision. "I want to learn to say something in your language," he said. She looked up, curious. "What do you want to learn? How to say I love you?" Her smile was radiant in the darkness. "Je t'aime," she said slowly. "That is I love you." "Je t'aime," he repeated carefully, the foreign words awkward on his tongue. She laughed softly. Again, "Je t'aime." He practiced several times until she nodded in approval. "Je t'aime, Solène," he said finally, the declaration feeling right despite the unfamiliar syllables. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she pressed a kiss to his lips. "I love you too, Kieran," she replied in English. As summer turned to fall, the Winters ranch began to prosper under their combined efforts. The garden that Solène had restored now provided much of their food, and her careful management of their household expenses allowed them to save enough to purchase additional cattle. Kieran found that having someone to work alongside, someone whose strengths complemented his own, made even the most difficult tasks bearable. Solène blossomed in her new life. While she sometimes missed France, particularly on holidays, or when reminded of her deceased parents, she had found a sense of purpose and belonging on the ranch that had eluded her in her old life. The hard work suited her, and the challenges of building a life in this harsh but beautiful land gave her a satisfaction she had never expected. In October, they were invited to a harvest festival in Yuma. The entire town gathered for music, dancing, and a community feast. Solène, whose English was now fluent enough for comfortable conversation, found herself surrounded by curious women eager to hear about life in France. "Is it true that Parisian women change their clothes 3 times a day?" asked young Emily Wilson, the blacksmith's daughter. Solène laughed. "Some do, perhaps, but not ordinary women like me." "But you're not ordinary at all," Mrs. Porter interjected. "Who would have thought a French lady could adapt so well to ranch life? You've made quite a home for Kieran. The man looks years younger since you arrived." Solène glanced across the gathering to where Kieran stood talking with Sam Taylor and several other ranchers. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled at her, a private look that made her cheeks warm. "We have made a good home together," she agreed. Later, as fiddles struck up a lively tune, Kieran led Solène onto the makeshift dance floor. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Winters?" he asked formally, his eyes twinkling. "Avec plaisir, Monsieur Winters," she replied, placing her hand in his. They moved together easily, their bodies finding a natural rhythm. Around them, Other couples danced, but Solène was aware only of Kieran, his strong hands guiding her, his familiar scent of leather and sage, the warmth in his eyes as he gazed down at her. "You know," he said as they whirled around the floor, "I never thanked that mail-order bride agency for their mistake." She tilted her head questioningly. "Mistake? Sending me a bride who didn't speak English," he clarified. "Best mistake that ever happened to me." Solène laughed. "Perhaps it was not a mistake. Perhaps it was destiny." "Destiny," Kieran repeated thoughtfully. "I like that idea." As winter approached, bringing with it shorter days and crisp, cold nights, Solène began to suspect a new change in their lives. Her monthly courses were late, and she found herself unusually tired in the afternoons. She kept her suspicions to herself for 2 weeks, wanting to be certain before sharing the news with Kieran. On a quiet Sunday morning in late November, as they sat drinking coffee on the porch despite the chill in the air, she decided it was time. "Kieran," she began, her heart fluttering nervously, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she assured him, taking his hand. "Je suis enceinte." When he looked confused, she switched to English. "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." Kieran stared at her for a long moment, stunned. Then a slow smile spread across his face, brighter than any she had seen before. "A baby," he repeated. "We're having a baby," she nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "In June, I think." Kieran whooped with joy, lifting her from her chair and spinning her around on the porch. "A baby," he shouted to the open landscape. "Solène and I are having a baby," she laughed through her tears, clinging to his shoulders. "Careful, you'll make me dizzy." He set her down immediately, his expression changing to one of concern. "I'm sorry. Are you all right? Should you be sitting down?" "Do you need anything?" "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, touching his cheek tenderly. "Just happy. Very happy." Kieran knelt before her chair, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Je t'aime," he said, his pronunciation now nearly perfect after months of practice. "Both of you." As the pregnancy progressed, Kieran became endearingly protective. He insisted on taking over the heavier chores, hired a local boy to help with the cattle, and made increasingly frequent trips to Yuma to satisfy Solène's cravings for strange combinations of foods. Mrs. Porter and the other women of the town supplied baby clothes and advice in equal measure, while Sam Taylor built them a beautiful wooden cradle as a gift. The winter was mild by Arizona standards, with just enough rain to promise good grazing for the cattle in spring. By February, Solène's condition was obvious, her slender frame now supporting a noticeable roundness. Kieran found her more beautiful than ever, her skin glowing and her eyes bright with anticipation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Solène working on a tiny gown for the baby while Kieran read aloud from a new novel, she felt a flutter in her belly. "Oh!" she exclaimed, her hand flying to her stomach. Kieran was instantly alert. "What is it? Are you in pain?" "No," she smiled, reaching for his hand. "The baby is moving. Here, feel." She placed his calloused palm against the spot. For a moment nothing happened, and then a distinct bump against his hand. Kieran's eyes widened in wonder. "That's our child," he whispered, awestruck. "Our son or daughter," Solène agreed. "What do you hope for?" Kieran considered the question seriously. "A healthy child first and foremost, but if I'm honest, I'd love a little girl with your eyes and spirit." "And I would love a boy with your strength and kindness," she countered, leaning against his shoulder. "Either way," Kieran said, "this child will be loved in 2 languages." Solène smiled at the thought. "Yes, and we'll hear stories of France and the Arizona Territory, a child of 2 worlds." Spring brought new growth to the ranch. Calves were born. The garden flourished under Solene's care, despite her increasing awkwardness, and the house underwent further improvements in preparation for the baby. Kieran added a nursery, converting a small storage room adjacent to their bedroom and furnishing it with the cradle from Sam and a rocking chair he purchased in Yuma. As June approached, the heat became intense. Solène, now in her final month of pregnancy, found the weather particularly challenging. She spent much of her time indoors, her feet propped up as Kieran had insisted, working on baby clothes or writing in a journal she had begun keeping for their child stories of her life in France, and her journey to America, written in both French and English. "I want our child to know both sides of their heritage," she explained when Kieran asked about the journal, "the same way I want them to speak both languages." "It's a wonderful idea," he agreed, kissing the top of her head. "Our child will have the best of both worlds." The baby arrived on a sweltering day in mid-June, a week earlier than expected. Kieran had ridden to a neighboring ranch to help with a broken irrigation pump when Solène felt the first pains. By the time he returned home in the late afternoon, her water had broken and the contractions were coming regularly. Panic seized him when he realized what was happening. "I'll ride for the doctor," he said, already turning for the door. "There's no time," Solène gasped, gripping the back of a chair as another contraction hit. "This baby is coming soon." "But I don't know what to do," Kieran protested, terrified. Solène managed a smile despite her pain. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. We will manage." In the end, Kieran rode quickly to the nearest neighbor, the Hendersons, whose ranch was only 20 minutes away at a gallop. Martha Henderson, a mother of 5, returned with him immediately, bringing her experienced hands and calm demeanor to the birthing room. The labor lasted through the night, with Kieran alternating between holding Solène's hand as she pushed and boiling water as Mrs. Henderson directed. Solène cried out in French during the worst of the pain, her native language surfacing in her distress. Though Kieran couldn't understand most of the words, he murmured encouragement and wiped her brow with cool cloths, his heart breaking at her suffering. Finally, as dawn broke over the eastern horizon, a new cry joined Solène's, the lusty wail of their child entering the world. "A boy, Mrs. Henderson announced triumphantly, cleaning the infant quickly before placing him on Solène's chest. "A fine, healthy boy." Kieran stared in amazement at the tiny, red-faced creature nestled against his wife's breast. The baby had a shock of dark hair like Solène's, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they seemed to be the same deep brown as well. "He's perfect," Kieran whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Solène looked up at him, exhausted but radiant. "Not our Phil's," she said softly. "Our son." They named him Thomas Alexander Winters Thomas after Kieran's father, and Alexander after Solène's. Mrs. Henderson stayed long enough to ensure that mother and baby were resting comfortably, then departed with promises to send her oldest daughter over later to help with household tasks. Left alone with his new family, Kieran sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Solène while she nursed their son. He had never imagined such contentment was possible, certainly not when he'd sent away for a mail-order bride out of desperation and practicality. "Thank you," he said, pressing a kiss to Solène's temple. "For what?" she asked drowsily. "For coming here. For staying even when it must have been terrifying. For giving me a son." He paused, searching for the right words. "For teaching me what love really means." Solène smiled up at him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Je t'aime de tout mon cœur," she said. "I love you with all my heart, too," Kieran replied, understanding the sentiment even if he didn't know all the words. As summer turned to fall once more, marking a full year since their wedding, the Winters ranch continued to prosper. Thomas grew rapidly, a happy baby with his mother's expressive eyes and his father's determined nature. Solène spoke to him exclusively in French, while Kieran used English, ensuring that their son would indeed grow up bilingual as they had planned. In October, they received an unexpected letter from France. Solène's cousin, whom she had not seen since childhood, had been trying to locate her after inheriting some family heirlooms that rightfully belonged to Solène. Among the items was her mother's wedding ring and a small but valuable collection of books that had been in the Valois family for generations. "We should go to France," Kieran said after reading the translated letter. "Next year, when Thomas is a bit older. You could show me Paris and your cousin could meet our son." Solène stared at him in disbelief. "You would do that? Travel all the way to France?" "Of course," he replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "It's part of who you are, which makes it part of our family. Besides," he added with a grin, "I've been practicing my French for over a year now. Might as well put it to use." Solène threw her arms around him, laughing through happy tears. "Oh, Kieran, I never thought I would see Paris again." "Well, Mrs. Winters," he said, holding her close, "I reckon there are going to be a lot of adventures in our future that neither of us ever expected." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, Solène reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. When she had boarded that ship in France, terrified but determined to forge a new life, she could never have imagined the happiness she would find in this remote corner of Arizona. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Kieran asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I was just thinking about destiny," she replied. "Do you remember at the Harvest Festival last year when you said sending a French bride who couldn't speak English was the best mistake the agency ever made?" He nodded, smiling at the memory. "I still believe it wasn't a mistake at all," she continued. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come in the most unexpected packages." Kieran reached over to take her free hand, running his thumb across her wedding band. "Je t'aime, Solène," he said, the French words now as natural to him as breathing. "Always and forever." "Je t'aime aussi," she replied softly. "Always and forever." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the Winters family sat together in contented silence, bound by a love that had transcended language, culture, and the vast distance between their worlds of origin. In finding each other, they had created something new and precious, a family that embodied the best of both their heritages, and a love story that would be told in two languages for generations to come. In the years that followed, the Winters Ranch grew to become one of the most successful in Yuma County. Kieran's innovative ranching methods, combined with Solène's careful management of their finances, allowed them to expand their holdings and improve their herd. The small garden behind the kitchen evolved into a productive orchard and vegetable patch that supplied not only their own needs, but provided extra produce to sell in town. Thomas was joined by two siblings, a sister named Marie Catherine, born 2 years after him, and another brother, James Henry, who arrived 3 years later. All 3 children grew up speaking both English and French fluently, moving effortlessly between the languages depending on which parent they were addressing. The family did indeed travel to France when Thomas was 15 months old, spending 2 months exploring Paris and Normandy. Kieran fell in love with the country that had shaped his wife, while Solène rediscovered her homeland through her husband's eyes, seeing its beauty anew. They returned to Arizona with Solène's family heirlooms, a trunk full of French books for their children, and countless memories to sustain them. As the children grew, so did the legend of how their parents had met the French bride, who arrived speaking no English, and the Arizona rancher who learned to say, "I love you," in her language. It became a favorite bedtime story, told sometimes by Kieran in his still accented French, sometimes by Solène in her now flawless English. In 1910, 25 years after Solène had first stepped off the train in Yuma, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary with a grand party at the ranch. Friends and family gathered from near and far, including Solène's cousin from France and Kieran's brother from Boston. Thomas, now a handsome young man of 24 with his father's height and his mother's dark eyes, had recently married the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Marie, at 22, was teaching at the Yuma schoolhouse, while 19-year-old James was studying medicine in San Francisco. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the property, Kieran led Solène away from the festivities to the quiet of their porch, the same porch where they had watched so many sunsets together over the years. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small package from his pocket. Solène unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of them on their wedding day, looking young and slightly apprehensive, facing the camera with formal expressions. "Oh, Kieran," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "Open the other side," he urged gently. She did, and found engraved in flowing script, "Je t'aime de tout mon cœur." "The first French phrase you ever taught me," Kieran said softly, "and the most important." Solène looked up at the man who had become her world, his dark hair now streaked with silver, his face weathered by years of working under the Arizona sun, but his eyes still the same clear blue that had first captured her heart. How far they had come from those first awkward days of gestures and dictionary consultations. "We have built a beautiful life together," she said, leaning into his embrace. "The most beautiful," he agreed. And it all started with two simple words, "Je t'aime." As they rejoined the celebration, surrounded by the family and community they had built together, Solène reflected that their story, unusual as it had been, was at its heart the simplest tale of all. Two people from different worlds who found in each other exactly what they needed, overcoming every barrier to forge a love that would endure for a lifetime and beyond. The language of love, they had discovered, transcended all others.